We got all our ducks in a row, Joey. It's like we had so many things. We got a checklist going here. I feel like I'm kind of high maintenance for him, but thank you. Um, let's see if we got this. All right, we're in business. Well, I know some of you to some extent here tonight, but not all of you. My name is Greg Enos. Pastor Jono asked me if I would want to participate in this teaching series on apologetics, the evidence for Christianity, which is super exciting for me. So thank you for having me here tonight. I appreciate it. It's exciting because is Christianity a blind faith? No, it's not. Blind faith is believing something when there's really no evidence that it's even true, isn't it? I like to say that Christianity is more like a trust that God will do what He said He would do based on good evidence that the entire story is true. And apologetics is about looking at all that evidence. I started studying the evidence for Christianity about 15 years ago. Why? Basically because I wanted to teach it to my kids who were really little at the time. And because here's my thinking, especially with kids, but really with everybody. If you're breathing, you have questions. I mean, even if you're a little bit alert and alive and aware of the world around you to some extent, you have questions. I wanted my kids to have questions, lots of questions, and I wanted to be able to know how to answer their questions, or at least find out where to get the answers. Because I think that one of the worst things that we can do for someone who has questions is to say, you just need to have what? Faith. Or maybe the Bible speaks for itself. And that may be true, and that is true, but some people just need more. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Socrates once said, the unexamined life is not worth living. And I would add that an unexamined faith maybe is not worth living. Because I don't know about you, but before I commit to believing in a particular faith or worldview, I want some level of confidence that it's actually true. Doesn't that make sense? Now, notice that I use the word worldview intentionally. And I don't want to distract from our topic too much, and I'm not going to be too long tonight, but I want to take a few minutes to talk about worldview because I think it's important. Did you know that you all have a worldview? Everybody has a worldview. It's unavoidable. A worldview is just the set of beliefs that a person has about the biggest questions in life. It's like a pair of glasses or lenses through which we view the world around us every day. Most people form their worldview at a very young age. According to George Barna, worldview is fully established in children before they reach the teenage years. And some people would say maybe even before the middle school years. So what questions are we talking about in terms of worldview? Well, questions about origin. Where did I come from? Where did everything come from? Do I matter? Questions about meaning. Why am I here? What is my purpose in life? Morality. What is right and wrong anyways? And as a result, how should I live my life? Questions about destiny. What happens when I die? Is this life all there is? And when it comes to the big questions in life like this, all worldviews are kind of like a religious faith. Let me illustrate with you what I mean by that. Up here, suppose we have all the different world religions, Christianity, Hinduism, Islam, Buddhism, and so forth. And you may know someone like my Mr. Emoji here. And he says, I don't believe any of these. I'm not religious. I'm neutral. But what this person may not understand is that if he doesn't believe in one of these religions, he's probably a naturalistic atheist. That's his worldview, a secular atheist. You see, nobody's neutral. Everybody has a worldview. Not choosing one of these at the top is still to make a choice. And I think that's important. Not to choose is still to make a choice. the old rock band Rush used to have a lyric that went something like that. I don't know if anybody remembers that, but it goes way back. And, interestingly, this is kind of what our public schools have done. They might say we're neutral, but all teaching is going to be from within the framework of one worldview or another. So our schools aren't really neutral. Maybe despite the best of intentions, they teach from within really an atheistic worldview. And sometimes it shows, doesn't it? I was talking to Luce about that earlier. Am I right about that, Luce? Would you agree with that? Yeah. So all that to say, I tend to use the terms worldview, faith, and religion interchangeably. I almost like to think in terms of worldview. So we all have questions. I think we should. And I've learned that Christianity has the answers. And I think it's very, very exciting. So tonight we're going to talk about the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. I'm going to try to present a brief sort of landscape view of the case for the resurrection. I have a handout for you if you've gotten that, so you can track along if you want. I put some good resources in there that are some of my favorite resources in bold, some of my very favorite ones. And if you want to go deeper, you can check those out. And then also on the back page, there are some discussion questions, and we'll break up into small groups. We can look at those questions when I'm done. I'll talk for about another 32 minutes, and we'll go from there. That sounds okay? Okay, by the way, some of you have heard me teach on this before. I've taught on the resurrection here. The content's going to be very much the same. So if you've heard this, just kick back and relax. And I was going to say something like have a smoke if you want to, but that's probably not too good in here. But just chill out, and it's okay. No smoking, Somebody would kill me if there was a smell in here. But as we start out, I just want to point out something very interesting and very unique about Christianity. Did you realize that all of Christianity actually depends on the resurrection as a real historical event that actually happened in the past? In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul is talking to the Corinthians about the resurrection, and he says, "Now tell me this, since we preach that Christ rose from the dead, why are some of you saying there will be no resurrection of the dead? For if there is no resurrection of the dead, then Christ has not been raised either. And if Christ has not been raised, then all of our preaching is useless, and your faith is useless, and we might as well all just go home. And we apostles would all be lying about God, because we said that God raised Christ from the grave. But that can't be true if there is no resurrection of the dead. And if there's no resurrection of the dead, then Christ has not been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, then your faith is useless and you are still guilty of your sins. In that case, all who have died believing in Christ are lost. And if our hope in Christ is only for this life, we are more to be pitied than anyone in the world. If Christ has not been raised, then all of our preaching is useless and your faith is useless." Do you see what Paul is doing here? He is hanging Christianity, all of Christianity, by a thread. And he's daring anybody to come along and cut it off. But nobody has. Nobody ever has. It must be made out of titanium or something. But Christianity stands or falls on the resurrection. Put it a different way, disprove the resurrection, and all of Christianity falls like a house of cards. And this is part of what we mean when we say that Christianity is an historical religion. We can examine it and test it because it's based on claims that certain events in history actually happened. We really mean it. We really believe it happened. So how do we go about investigating the evidence for such an incredible claim as the resurrection? Well, it's what historians do to investigate any past event. So let's take a minute to talk about that, to talk about the approach. What they do, historians and scholars, is they just gather up as much source material as they possibly can, and they evaluate it to see if any of it is reliable enough to identify any hard facts with certainty surrounding the event. If they can determine any obvious, undisputed facts, that would typically be referred to as historical bedrock. They like early accounts, they like eyewitness accounts, and just about as much source material from anywhere at all, that they can possibly gather. And they'll typically assign levels of reliability for each of the sources. Some of them will use a scale of 1 to 5, maybe 1 to 10. So the process becomes somewhat quantitative in that way. Once they establish the hard facts, if they can, then they brainstorm all possible explanations for what might have happened surrounding the event that all of the facts would fit into. Kind of an illustration of this would be this little baby puzzle. The facts would be like the puzzle pieces, and the different theories would be different boards that the pieces fit into. Now, we know that if a theory is the truth of what happened, then all of the facts that have been identified surrounding the event will fit nicely into place, with none of them left out and none of them that need to be force-fit awkwardly in there for some reason. Now, all of this is an example of abductive reasoning. I think it's kind of funny that a lot of people think that Christianity is not logical. But this is one example in one area where we use a very highly regarded logical methodology. We identify the facts and determine the best explanation. All of the facts have to fit. And the one defending a particular theory bears the burden of proof to demonstrate that all of the facts fit their theory. This is known as the inference to the best explanation. Does it sound familiar at all, this approach? Investigating an event in the past. It should, because this is just what courtrooms all across the country are doing every day when they're investigating some alleged past event, maybe a crime. So this is what they're doing. So our question is the source material related to the resurrection of high enough integrity that we can establish any hard facts surrounding the events? And this is where the work of Gary Habermas comes in. Definitely a rock star in the apologetics world. And it's where we get the minimal facts approach to the resurrection. Gary Habermas is a professor, historian, and a New Testament scholar at Liberty University these days. He researched and studied the conclusions of thousands of professional historians and scholars who have studied all the source material surrounding the resurrection and, in fact, all of early Christianity. He went out and collected more than 2,400 of the most critical scholarly works on the resurrection written between 1975 and 2014 in English, French, and German to find out what they concluded. And he cross-checked them all to see if there were any facts that they all agreed on. Now, these are scholars from all across the theological spectrum, believers, both conservative and liberal, and unbelievers and skeptics. Believe it or not, there have been many historians and scholars who are not believers who have investigated the events surrounding early Christianity. And the answer he found was yes. He found that virtually all scholars agree that certain points concerning Jesus and Christianity are actual historical facts. Now, this is kind of interesting because this approach eliminates any bias. Any historian will know that any one person, any one of us, if we go to investigate something, we're going to bring our bias into it, even if we don't want to, even if we try not to. We're drawing on a pool of thousands of historians, all diverse in their different views. And also, we are not appealing to the Bible in any kind of a biased way. The New Testament documents are evaluated according to their own merit, like any other document of antiquity and no one can really deny that. In other words, we're not invoking the inspiration of Scripture in any way at all. Now, Gary Habermas identified 12 minimal facts that virtually all scholars and historians agree on. For the sake of time, we're going to look at just 5 of them because I think it's enough to make a pretty airtight case, and you'll see what I mean. And these facts are considered by all of them to be historical bedrock. All right, before we continue into the facts and then some of the different theories, I want to give you a sense of some of the source material that historians have to work with because it is a lot. First, we do have the 4 Gospels that are in the New Testament, understood to be written in the genre of biography. We have Paul's letters in the New Testament. They are actually considered to be a very high historical reliability by everybody because if you remember, he was an enemy of the Christians before the resurrection until he saw Jesus as he claims. We have oral traditions that are embedded in the writings. These are very important and significant to scholars. These are accounts that were circulating early by word of mouth. For example, 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8, we'll take a brief look at that, and there are others embedded in the New Testament. But I think what is significant is we have at least 10 non-Christian writers as in source material, different writings. These are considered of high reliability because there's no way that you could call them biased. If anything, you would think they might be biased against Christianity. We have some of the early church leaders start going into the beginnings of church history, like Clement, who knew Peter, and Polycarp, who probably knew the Apostle John and the things that they wrote. We have at least 42 writers who mention Jesus within 150 years of his life. From historical records, in that point of view, this is rich and very remarkable. In contrast, we have 10 authors that mention Tiberius Caesar, who was the Roman emperor during Christ's ministry. So I just want you to know that the source material is rich, and what you can get from just the 10 non-Christian sources and writers alone is a huge amount. All right, well, let's take a look at the 5 facts surrounding the resurrection. These are considered historical bedrock again because virtually every scholar agrees on these facts. First, the first fact is that Jesus died by Roman crucifixion. Of course, we have this in all 4 of the gospel accounts, and at least 4 non-Christian accounts. We have it in Josephus, Tacitus, Lucian, and the Jewish Talmud that Jesus died by execution on a Roman cross. It's interesting, notice that this presupposes that Jesus actually lived and he wasn't a myth. You know, sometimes you see the magazine articles or other articles that come out and somebody advancing the idea that about the mythical Jesus. Who was this Jesus? Nobody who's serious really doubts that this Jesus of Nazareth actually lived. And not only that, everybody agrees that he was executed on a Roman cross. So there's no dispute within scholarship about this. The second is that the tomb was found empty just a few days later. Everyone agrees on this. This was proclaimed in Jerusalem where Jesus had been executed, right there at the scene. There is no evidence anywhere in any of the source material, that there was ever a body found. We see accusations by enemies of Christianity that the disciples stole the body. We see that in Matthew 28. We see that in Justin Martyr and Tertullian. And about the empty tomb, some of the early testimony is surrounding what is the testimony of women, the women who discovered the tomb. And that is something that wouldn't be made up because that is something due to the culture of the day that would be embarrassing at that time. The testimony of women wasn't admissible in courts of law at that time. Third fact is that the disciples believed that he rose from the dead and appeared to them. We know, everybody knows that the disciples were radically changed. This is what was responsible for the explosive growth of the church, the early church, which is undeniable from a historical point of view. They were all confused and afraid, but they were somehow convinced that he rose from the dead. Now, to be fair, the language in these facts is pretty precise. We're not saying that they definitely saw him, but that they were convinced that they did. All historians and scholars, no matter their beliefs, agree on this. Fourth, James, a brother of Jesus and a skeptic. James did not believe in the things that Jesus taught. He was a skeptic until after the resurrection, until after an appearance of the risen Jesus. Last, Paul also. Paul, again, was an enemy of the early Christians, an enemy of the early church, but he was convinced due to what he believed was an appearance of the risen Jesus. This is a powerful one because Paul, again, was an enemy. Something happened to him to completely change him. You can't say that he was an earlier follower of Jesus, so he was biased in some way, and you can't say that about James either. So these are our 5 facts. All right, let's take a look at some of the theories that have been proposed over the years, even over the centuries. We'll take a look at them one by one. And as I list them out, the numbers in parentheses will be the facts that don't fit that particular theory. Okay, the first one is that the resurrection was some kind of a legend. This one says that the resurrection is simply a fabrication that was made up and evolved over a long period of time to try to vindicate a leader long since dead, or to validate the teachings of Jesus and his claims. And religious studies classes will typically teach this. It's kind of like, stories told around the campfire, summer after summer after summer. They get exaggerated and they get embellished. Well, if the resurrection was an embellishment that appeared over time, it would mean that the original story told by the disciples did not include the resurrection. But we know that it did. The facts tell us that they believed they saw the risen Jesus. And this is all over the New Testament. We see it with Peter, who said, God has raised this Jesus to life, and we are all witnesses of the fact. Again, Peter, you killed the author of life, but God raised him from the dead. We are witnesses of this. And Paul, for many days, he was seen by those who had traveled with him from Galilee to Jerusalem. They are now his witnesses to our people. In fact, the gospel message at the time was simply the resurrection. The disciples, the apostles were going out and claiming the resurrection and that they saw him. That was the gospel at the time. We have early oral tradition. Again, for example, 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8. This was written about AD 55. I passed on to you, Paul says, what was most important and what had also been passed on to me. So he's talking about the past when he was earlier talking to the Corinthians. That Christ died for our sins, just as the scripture said. He was buried and he was raised from the dead on the 3rd day. Paul is talking about information given earlier than this, and many scholars believe within 1 to 3 years after the events. These things are studied in depth. Gerd Ludemann was a German biblical scholar and historian, and he was a skeptic. He was not a believer. He says that the elements in the tradition are to be dated to the first 2 years after the crucifixion of Jesus, not later than 3 years. The formation of the appearance traditions mentioned in 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8, falls into the time between 30 and 33 AD. So the resurrection claim can actually be traced all the way back basically to the event. And before the apostles started writing down the documents of the New Testament, these stories were circulating. The appearances were the cause of the conversions of Paul and James, so the resurrection could not have been a later invention. So a legend fails on the appearances, and it also fails on the empty tomb. Okay, the next theory would be that maybe the disciples lied or stole the body. This is the conspiracy theory, that Jesus' disciples went to his tomb and stole the body, and then they lied about it. Well, this would mean that there were no appearances to anybody. James and Paul wouldn't be convinced of a missing body alone. They would, like anybody, they would probably suspect foul play. I mean, imagine if we heard the news came out that the tomb of Joseph Smith was recently discovered to be empty. Would that be enough for any one of us to want to change our faith? Now, the disciples were totally changed and willing to die for their beliefs. According to church tradition, all of the disciples eventually suffered persecution and horrible deaths for what they claimed. Peter, eventually crucified upside down. Andrew, Peter's brother, crucified. Philip, crucified in Hierapolis. Bartholomew, flayed with knives in Armenia. James, John's brother, killed by the sword. Matthew, killed by the sword in Ethiopia. Matthias, stoned to death. Thomas, speared to death in India. John died after exile on Patmos. Luke, hanged. James, brother of Jesus, stoned to death. Mark, dragged by horse. Jude, killed by arrows. Paul, beheaded by Nero in Rome. Liars don't become martyrs. Nobody dies for a lie. Why would you do that? There's no account in history saying that any one of them ever denied their claims before they died. There's only a very small number of critical scholars that have opted for this view in about the last 200 years. The third theory would be, well, maybe someone other than the disciples stole the body. Maybe it was somebody else. Maybe it was, who was there? There was the Jews and there were the Romans, but they wanted to crush Christianity at the time, so this wouldn't be in their best interest. It would be better for them to get the body and parade it through the city for everybody to see. Well, maybe it was somebody else. Who was it? It doesn't really matter because, again, an empty tomb alone, it doesn't account for anybody's belief that they had seen the risen Jesus. It keeps coming back to this. The appearances are really key in all of this. So this fails on all the appearances. A missing body isn't enough to convince anyone of a resurrection. Mary Magdalene thought the gardener took the body, if you remember that. Peter was not convinced, and Thomas had to see him before he would believe. And very few scholars have held this view in the last 100 years. Okay, well, the next one would be the wrong or unknown tomb. This one would say that the witnesses went to the wrong tomb, or the body of Jesus was thrown into some kind of a common grave for criminals, unknown to the disciples. Maybe because of that, it disappeared very quickly. William Lane Craig says this about that. He says, a wrong tomb theory assumes that all the Jews and the Romans who would like to have a body had a kind of collective amnesia about what they had done with the body. And you have to ask, is that likely? Is that likely to have happened? Again, it misses on all the appearances. It's another case where a missing body alone will not convince anyone of a resurrection. The next theory would be the apparent death. This one says that Jesus didn't really die on the cross, but he fell into a coma and survived. Maybe the cold air and the spices in the tomb resuscitated him. This is very unlikely considering the nature of a Roman scourging and crucifixion. In an article written quite a while ago now, the very prestigious Journal of the American Medical Association had this to say about that. They said, clearly the weight of historical and medical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead before the wound to his side was inflicted, and supports the traditional view that the spear thrust between his right ribs probably perforated not only the right lung, but also the pericardium and heart, and thereby ensured his death. Accordingly, the interpretations based on the assumption that Jesus did not die on the cross appear to be at odds with modern medical knowledge. Well, you could follow it further and suppose that he does revive somehow. He manages to unwrap himself in the tomb and moves the stone. How? He would have nothing. You would need a jack or something to do that. He would have terribly crippling, mutilating wounds, and he would be limping, at best. And the disciples would not believe under this scenario that he came back from the dead. They would want to get him to a doctor, and they'd want to hide him. It would not explain the transformation of their lives. The next theory would be the hallucination theory. This one says that when the disciples, James and Paul, claimed they saw the risen Jesus, they had actually only seen hallucinations. Well, this might work if Jesus supposedly appeared to just one person. You know that both Mormonism and Islam are based on the private visions of just one man. That's interesting. But not Christianity. Multiple people don't hallucinate the same thing. Gary Collins was an author and professor, president of the National Association of Psychologists and Counselors. And he said, hallucinations are individual occurrences. By their very nature, only one person can see any given hallucination at a time. They certainly are not something which can be seen by a group of people. Neither is it possible that one person could somehow induce a hallucination in somebody else. Since a hallucination exists only in this subjective personal sense, it's obvious that others cannot witness it. And we know that, don't we? Isn't that pretty clear? You could ask, why would an enemy like Paul hallucinate Jesus or James the skeptic? Paula Fredrickson was a liberal scholar of religious studies at Boston University, so she's a skeptic. And she said, I know in their own terms what they say, or that what they saw was the raised Jesus. That's what they say, and then all of the historic evidence we have afterwards attests to their conviction that that's what they saw. She goes on to say, I'm not saying that they really did see the raised Jesus. She says, I wasn't there. I don't know what they saw, but I do know that as a historian, that they must have seen something. And that's very interesting for her to say. Notice that she readily agrees as a historian that the disciples must have seen something. Nobody disputes that. And that they believed they saw the risen Jesus. But then she says, I don't know what they saw. We'll never know. But that doesn't work. You can't just say that. She's saying, that's what they say, but I don't believe them. You can't acknowledge that kind of evidence and just walk away. The appearances demand an explanation. You just can't ignore that and walk away. Okay, the next theory would be the twin theory or imposter. That Jesus died and he was buried, but shortly afterwards, his long-lost identical twin brother or another imposter emerged on the scene and then was worshipped as the risen Jesus. Well, this fails on the empty tomb because Jesus' body would be in it, and that could have been checked. This would require a conspiracy, obviously, to put the twin on the scene at just the right time. Who would do that? You need to ask that question. Wouldn't people notice any kind of a difference at all in speech or dialect or how the person behaved? What about James, Jesus' brother, or Mary? Wouldn't Mary know about a twin? You would think. A suspected imposter could be tested if they start wondering, like, okay, Jesus, do you remember when we were out on the Sea of Galilee and that big storm came up? Man, we were all terrified, and we found you asleep in the front of the boat. You know, and Jesus says, yeah, you guys had so little faith. Wait a minute, who are you? That was not the front of the boat. So an imposter could be tested. Next theory, that maybe a substitute Jesus' place on the cross. This one says that someone else was on the cross. It misses on all five. You have to ask, can so many witnesses to the resurrection be wrong that it was someone else there on the cross? It's kind of like saying Abraham Lincoln wasn't the one killed next to his wife. Was Mary Lincoln mistaken? It misses on the empty tomb. A body would be in there. It doesn't explain the appearances because Jesus had wounds that his disciples could see. Muslims believe that Jesus didn't really die on the cross because of something that is written in the Quran. But the Quran comes 600 years after the life of Jesus, so historians actually don't consider it very reliable source material. It's too far removed. Okay, the next one would be the existential or the spiritual resurrection. This one says that Jesus rose from the dead not really in history, but only in our hearts. That would be existential. Or Jesus' physical body did not rise from the dead. Instead, he rose from the dead as a spirit. And the Jehovah's Witnesses would teach this and believe this. It misses on the empty tomb. That could have been checked. It misses on the appearances. They all thought that they had seen Jesus in a real physical body. They touched him. They ate fish with them. And there was very real evidence throughout all the source material that he was very physical. Okay, next theory would be that Jesus was an alien. And interestingly, you can make all the facts fit in this one. And I'm serious. This is a theory that's been advanced in the past. This is kind of like Star Trek, that the body on the cross was really a very realistic android or robot. Okay? It was later exchanged by transporter or teleportation by maybe a cloaked or a hidden ship for the real living Jesus, alien Jesus, after it appeared to be dead. Again, all the facts fit. Well, you could say that by proper definition, Jesus was an alien, in his divine nature at least, and he had access to the Father's power. But that aside, this is too easy. This is too easy a theory. I mean, how do you know that I'm not an alien? How do we know that half of us are not aliens? How do you even investigate that? But what I think is more significant, to support this theory, if you want to defend this theory, you'd have to provide some pretty good evidence that this kind of intelligent life can and does exist elsewhere in the universe. And that's a pretty tall order, considering things like the anthropic principle of the earth. And I think you guys talked about that earlier with Jono. Finally, the last theory would be the bodily resurrection, that Jesus actually rose physically from the grave as claimed by the disciples and the rest of the early church. And all of the facts nicely fit. Notice here that no other theory even comes close, not even close, except for the alien theory. But this stands way above all of the others. And if you remember, I mentioned that Gary Habermas had actually identified 12 facts. We only looked at 5. But if you were to look at all 12, it's much more dramatic. No other theory even comes close. And again, it's really the appearances that changed everything and caused the early church to take off like wildfire. Some scholars would say that the empty tomb was a necessary, was a, what am I, I'm trying to remember this, it's not here for me, but the empty tomb was one condition, but it was the appearances that were really a necessary condition. Necessary condition. As we wrap up, I would just ask the question. I mean, it begs the question, if it happened, what does it mean? Well, it means that the Christian faith is definitely not a blind faith. It is grounded on facts of history and reality. We have a worldview that we can invest in, that we can really believe in. The resurrection means that Christianity is true. And Roy mentioned that I went back to school to study this, and it was very interesting that all the different classes we took on apologetics, everything seemed to sort of circle around and come back towards the resurrection for some reason. The resurrection is central to Christianity. And it gives us such hope, real hope. I like this quote I saw in a Daily Bread devotion once a while ago. Biblical hope is much more than mere optimism. It's an absolute certainty based on God's promise, which he will never break. And I love that. Jesus rose from the dead to prove that everything that he said and taught was true. And the things that he said and taught, well, that's how we derive the biblical worldview. Forgiveness and salvation are available to anyone who would choose to believe. And no matter what happens in this life, our future is in heaven. And that is the Christian hope. That's our hope. And that's all I've got for tonight. So what we're going to do now is on the back of your handout, I've listed a couple of questions. And I guess you guys do this, break into small groups. So we'll do that.